Hello, everybody. This is Princess Mayblossom. Once upon a time, there lived a king and queen whose children had all died, first one and then another, until at last only one little daughter remained. The queen was at her wits' end to know where to find a really good nurse who would take care of her and bring her up. A herald was sent who blew a trumpet at every street corner and commanded all the best nurses to appear before the queen, that she might choose one for the little princess. So on the appointed day the whole palace was crowded with nurses, who came from the four corners of the world to offer themselves, until the queen declared that if she was ever to see the half of them, they must be brought out to her one by one, as she sat in a shady wood near the palace. This was accordingly done, and the nurses, after they had made their curtsy to the king and queen, ranged themselves in a line before her that she might choose. Most of them were fair and fat and charming, but one was dark-skinned and ugly, and spoke a strange language which nobody could understand. The queen wondered how she dared offer herself, and she was told to go away, upon which she muttered something and passed on, but hid herself in a hollow tree from which she could see all that happened. The queen, without giving her another thought, chose a pretty rosy-faced nurse, but no sooner was her choice made than a snake bit the very nurse on the foot, and she fell down as if dead. The queen was very much vexed by this accident, but she soon selected another nurse, who was just stepping forward when an eagle flew by and dropped a large tortoise upon her head. At this the queen was horrified. Nevertheless, she chose a third one, but with no better fortune, for the nurse, moving quickly, ran into the branch of a tree and blinded herself with a thorn. Then the queen, in dismay, cried out that there must be some malignant influence at work, and that she would choose no more that day. She had just risen to return to the palace when she heard peals of malicious laughter behind her, and turning round saw the ugly strangers she had dismissed, making merry over the disasters and mocking everyone, but especially the queen. Suddenly the witch, for she was a witch, with 2 blows from a wand, summoned a chariot of fire drawn by winged dragons, and was whirled off through the air, uttering threats and cries. When the king saw this, he cried, "Alas! Now we are ruined indeed, for that was no other than the fairy Caraboss, who has had a grudge against me ever since I was a boy, and put sulphur into her porridge one day for fun." Then the queen began to cry. The king was sorry to have frightened her so much, and proposed they should hold a council and decide what had best be done to avert the misfortunes which Caraboss certainly meant to bring upon the little princess. So all the counselors were summoned to the palace, and when they had shut every door and window and stuffed up every keyhole so that they might not be overheard, they talked it over, and decided that every fairy for 1,000 leagues round should be invited to the christening of the princess, and that the time of the ceremony should be kept a profound secret in case the fairy Caraboss should take it into her head to attend. The queen and her ladies set to work to prepare presents for the fairies who were invited. For each one there was a blue velvet cloak, a petticoat of apricot satin, a pair of high-heeled shoes, some sharp needles, and a pair of golden scissors. Only 5 were able to come on the day appointed, but they began immediately to bestow gifts upon the princess. One promised that she should be perfectly beautiful, the second that she should understand anything, no matter what, the first time it was explained to her, the third that she should sing like a nightingale, the fourth that she should succeed in everything she undertook, and the 5th was opening her mouth to speak when a tremendous rumbling was heard in the chimney, and Caraboss, all covered in soot, came rolling down, crying, "I say that she shall be the unluckiest of the unlucky until she is 20 years old." Then the queen and all the fairies begged her to think better of it, and not be so unkind to the poor little princess, who had never done her any harm, but the ugly old fairy only grunted and made no answer. So the last fairy, who had not yet given her gift, tried to mend matters by promising the princess a long and happy life after the fatal time was over. At this Caraboss laughed maliciously and climbed away up the chimney, leaving them all in great consternation, especially the queen. However, she entertained the fairies splendidly, and gave them beautiful ribbons, of which they were very fond, in addition to other presents. When they were going away, the oldest fairy said that it would be best to shut the princess up with her waiting woman until she was 20 years old. So the king had a tower built on purpose. It had no windows, so it was lighted with wax candles, and the only way into it was by an underground passage which had iron doors only 20 feet apart and guards posted everywhere. The princess had been named Mayblossom because she was as fresh and blooming as spring itself, and she grew up tall and beautiful, and everything she did and said was charming. The king and queen came to see her, and were more delighted with her than ever, but though she was weary of the tower, and often begged them to take her away, they always refused. The princess's nurse, who had never left her, sometimes told her about the world outside the tower, and though the princess had never seen anything for herself, she always understood exactly, thanks to this second fairy's gift. Often the king said to the queen, "We were cleverer than Caraboss after all. Our Mayblossom will be happy in spite of her predictions." And the queen laughed until she was tired at the idea of having outwitted the old fairy. At last they had the princess's portrait painted and sent to all the neighboring courts, for in 4 days she would have completed her 20th year. All the towns were rejoicing at the thought of the princess's approaching freedom, and when the news came that King Merlin was sending his ambassador to ask her in marriage for his son, they were still more delighted. The nurse, who kept the princess informed of everything that went forward in the town, did not fail to repeat the news that so nearly concerned her, and gave such a description of the splendor in which the ambassador, Fanfaronade, would enter the town that the princess was wild to see the procession for herself. "What an unhappy creature I am," she cried. "I have never seen the sun, or the stars, or a horse, or a monkey, or a lion, except in pictures. And though the king and queen tell me I am free when I am 20, I believe they only say it to keep me amused. They never mean to let me out at all." And then she began to cry, and her nurse and all the nurse's daughter and the nursery maid, who all loved her dearly, cried too for company. When the princess saw that they all pitied her, she made up her mind to have her own way. So she declared she would starve herself if they did not find some means of letting her see Fanfaronade's grand entry into the town. "If you really love me," she said, "you will manage it, somehow or another, and the king and queen need never know anything about it." The nurse and all the others said everything they could think of to turn the princess from her idea, but the more they said, the more determined she was, and at last they consented to make a tiny hole in the tower on the side that looked toward the city gates. After scratching and scraping all day and night, they presently made a hole through which they could, with great difficulty, push a very slender needle, and out of this the princess looked at the daylight for the first time. She was so dazzled and delighted by what she saw that she stayed there, never taking her eyes away from the peephole for a single minute, until presently the ambassador's procession appeared in sight. At the head of it rose Fanfaronade himself, upon a white horse which pranced and caracoled to the sound of trumpets. Nothing could have been more splendid than the ambassador's attire. His coat was nearly hidden under an embroidery of pearls and diamonds, his boots were solid gold, and from his helmet floated scarlet plumes. At the sight of him the princess lost her wits entirely, and determined that Fanfaronade had nobody else would she marry. "It's quite impossible," she said, "that his master should be half as handsome and delightful. I am not ambitious, and having spent all my life in this tedious tower, anything, even a house in the country, will seem a delightful change. I am sure that bread and water shared with Fanfaronade will please me better than roast chicken and sweetmeats with anybody else." And she went on talking, until her waiting woman wondered. When they tried to stop her and represented that her high rank made it impossible that she should do any such thing, she would not listen and ordered them to be silent. As soon as the ambassador arrived at the palace, the queen started to fetch her daughter. All the streets were spread with carpets, and the windows were crowded with ladies who were waiting to see the princess, and carried baskets of flowers and sweetmeats to shower upon her as she passed. They had hardly begun to dress the princess when a dwarf arrived, mounted upon an elephant. He came from the 5 fairies, and brought for the princess a crown, a scepter, and a robe of golden brocade, with a petticoat marvelously embroidered with butterflies' wings. They also sent a casket of jewels, so splendid that no one had ever seen anything like it before, and the queen was quite dazzled when she opened it. But the princess scarcely gave a glance at any of these treasures, for she thought of nothing but Fanfaronade. The dwarf was rewarded with a gold piece, and decorated with so many ribbons that it was hardly possible to see him at all. The princess sent to each of the fairies a new spinning wheel with a distaff of cedar wood, and the queen said she must look through her treasures and find something very charming to send to them also. When the princess was arrayed in all the gorgeous things the dwarf had brought, she was more beautiful than before, and as she walked along the streets, the people cried, "How pretty she is! How pretty she is!" As they proceeded at the stately pace, the sky began to grow dark, and suddenly the thunder growled, and rain and hail fell in torrents. The queen put her royal mantle over her head, and the princess did the same with their reins. Then a terrific croaking, as of an immense army of crows, rooks, ravens, screech owls, and all birds of ill omens was heard, and at the same instant a huge owl skimmed up to the princess and threw over her a scarf woven of spiders' webs and embroidered with bats' wings. Then peals of mocking laughter rang through the air, and they guessed that it was another of the fairy Caraboss's unpleasant jokes. The queen was terrified and tried to pull the black scarf from the princess's shoulders, but it really seemed as if it must be glued on, it clung so closely. "Ah," cried the queen, "can nothing appease the enemy of ours? What good was it that I sent her more than 50 pounds of sweetmeats? She is as angry as ever." While she lamented and everybody was as wet as if they had been dragged through a river, the princess still thought of nothing but the ambassador, and just at this moment he appeared before her with the king. There was a great blowing of trumpets, and all the people shouted louder than ever. Fanfaronade was not generally at a loss for something to say, but when he saw the princess, she was so much more beautiful and majestic than he expected, that he could only stammer out a few words, and entirely forgot the harangue with which he had been learning for months, and knew well enough to have repeated in his sleep. To gain time to remember at least part of it, he made several low bows to the princess, who on her side dropped 6 curtsies without stopping to think. And then she said, "Sir Ambassador, I am sure that everything you intend to say is charming, since it is you who mean to say it. But let us make haste to the palace. It is pouring cats and dogs, and the wicked fairy Caraboss will be amused to see us all stand dripping here. When we are once under shelter, we can laugh at her." Upon this the ambassador found his tongue and replied gallantly. Then he offered his hand to conduct the princess, and she said softly, "As you could not possibly guess how much I like you, Sir Fanfaronade, I am obliged to tell you plainly that since I saw you enter the town on your beautiful prancing horse, I have been sorry you came to speak for another instead of yourself. So if you think about it as I do, I will marry you instead of your master. Of course I know you are not a prince, but I shall be just as fond of you as if you were, and we can go and live in some cozy little corner of the world and be as happy as the days are long." The ambassador thought he must be dreaming, could hardly believe the lovely princess said, but he dared not answer. When they reached the palace, the king kissed his daughter on both cheeks. Then he and the queen led the way to the banquet. Everybody feasted except Mayblossom and Fanfaronade, who looked at one another and forgot everything else. After the banquet came a ball, and after that a ballet, and at last they were all so tired that everybody fell asleep just where they sat. Only the lovers were as wide awake as mice, and the princess, seeing there was nothing to fear, said to Fanfaronade, "Let us be quick and run away, for we shall never have a better chance." Then she took the king's dagger, which was in a diamond sheath, and the queen's kerchief, and gave her hand to Fanfaronade, who carried a lantern, and they ran together into the muddy street and down to the seashore. Here they got into a little boat in which the poor old boatswain was sleeping. When he woke up and saw the lovely princess with all her diamonds and her spider-web scarf, he did not know what to think, and obeyed her instantly when she commanded him to set out. They could see neither moon nor stars, but in the queen's kerchief there was a carbuncle which glowed with like 50 torches. Fanfaronade asked the princess where she would like to go, but she only answered that she did not care so long as he was with her. "But, princess," said he, "I dare not take you back to King Merlin's court. He would think hanging too good for me." "Oh, in that case," she answered, "we had better go to Squirrel Island. It's lonely enough and too far off for anyone to follow us there." So she ordered the old boatman to steer for Squirrel Island. Meanwhile the day was breaking, and the king and queen and all the courtiers began to wake up and rub their eyes and think it was time to finish the preparations for the wedding. The queen asked for her kerchief. Then there was a scurrying hither and thither and a hunting everywhere. They looked in every place, from the wardrobes to the stoves, and the queen herself ran about from the garret to the cellar, and the kerchief was nowhere to be found. By this time the king had missed his dagger, and the search began all over again. They opened boxes and chests of which the keys had been lost for 100 years, and found numbers of curious things, but not the dagger. And the king tore his beard, and the queen tore her hair, and the kerchief and the dagger were the most valuable things in the kingdom. When the king saw that the search was hopeless, he said, "Never mind. Let us make haste and get the wedding over before everything is lost." And then when he asked where the princess was, upon this her nurse came forward and said, "Sire, I have been seeking her for these 2 hours, but she is nowhere to be found." This was more than the queen could bear, and she gave a shriek of alarm and fainted away, and they had to pour 2 barrels of eau de cologne over her before she recovered. When she came to herself, everybody was looking for the princess in the greatest terror and confusion, but as she did not appear, the king said to his page, "Go and find Ambassador Fanfaronade, who is doubtless asleep in some corner, and tell him the sad news." So the page hunted hither and thither, but Fanfaronade was no more to be found than the princess, the dagger, or the kerchief. Then the king summoned his counselors and his guards, and, accompanied by the queen, went into this great hall. And he had not had time to prepare his speech beforehand. The king ordered that silence should be kept for 3 hours, and at the end of the time he spoke as follows. "Listen, great and small. My dear daughter Mayblossom is lost. Whether she has been stolen away or has simply disappeared, I cannot tell. The queen's kerchief and my dagger, which are worth their weight in gold, are also missing. And what is worst of all, the ambassador Fanfaronade is nowhere to be found. Advise me, my dear subjects, what I had better do to recover my daughter, Fanfaronade, and the other things." This was the most eloquent speech the king had been known to make, and when everybody was done admiring it, the prime minister made answer, "Sire, we are all very sorry to see you so sad. We would give everything we value in the world to take away the cause of your sorrow, but this seems to be another of the tricks of the fairy Carabosse. The princess's 20 unlucky years were not quite over, really, if the truth must be told. I noticed that Fanfaronade and the princess appeared to admire each other greatly. Perhaps this may give some clue to the mystery of their disappearance." Here the queen interrupted him, saying, "Take care what you say, sir. Believe me, the Princess Mayblossom was far too well brought up to think of falling in love with an ambassador." At this the nurse came forward, and falling on her knees, confessed how they had made a hole in the tower, and how the princess had declared when she saw the ambassador that she would marry him and nobody else. Then the queen was very angry, and gave the nurse and the nursery maid such a scolding that they shook in their shoes. But the Admiral Cocked Hat interrupted her, crying, "Let us be off after this good-for-nothing Fanfaronade, for without a doubt he has run away with our princess." So while some embarked upon the sea, others ran from kingdom to kingdom, beating drums and blowing trumpets, and wherever a crowd collected they cried, "Whoever wants a beautiful doll, sweetmeats of all kinds, a little pair of scissors, a golden robe or satin hat, has only to say where Fanfaronade has hidden the Princess Mayblossom." But the answer everywhere was, "You must go farther. We have not seen them." However, those who went by sea were more fortunate, for after sailing about for some time they noticed a light before them which burned at night like a great fire. At first they dared not go near it, not knowing what it may be, but by and by it remained stationary over Squirrel Island. The light was the glowing of the carbuncle. The princess and Fanfaronade, on landing upon the island, had given the boatman 100 gold pieces, and made a promise solemnly to tell no one where he had taken them. But as he rowed away, he got into the midst of the fleet, and before he could escape, the admiral had seen him and sent a boat after him. When he was searched, they found the gold pieces in his pocket, and as they were new coins struck in honor of the princess's wedding, the admiral felt certain the boatman must have been paid by the princess to aid her in their flight. But he would not answer any questions, and pretended to be deaf and dumb. Then the admiral said, "Oh, deaf and dumb, is he? Lash him to the mast, and give him the taste of the cat o' nine tails. I don't know anything better than that for curing the deaf and dumb." And when the old boatman saw that he was in earnest, he told all he knew about the cavalier and the lady, and he landed upon Squirrel Island, and the admiral knew it must be the princess and Fanfaronade, so he gave the order for the fleet to surround the island. Meanwhile, Princess Mayblossom had found a grassy bank, and throwing herself down, had fallen into a profound slumber, when Fanfaronade, who happened to be hungry and not sleepy, came and woke her up, saying very crossly, "Pray, madam, how long do you mean to stay here? I see nothing to eat, and though you may be very charming, the sight of you does not prevent me from famishing." "What, Fanfaronade," said the princess, sitting up and rubbing her eyes, "is it possible that, when I am here with you, you can want something else? You ought to be thinking all the time of how happy you are." "Happy?" cried he. "Say rather unhappy. I wish with all my heart you were back in your dark tower again." "Darling, don't be cross," said the princess. "I will go and see if I can find some wild fruit for you." "I wish you might find a wolf to eat you up," growled Fanfaronade. The princess, in great dismay, ran hither and thither all about the wood, tearing her dress and hurting her pretty white hands with the thorns and brambles, but she could find nothing good to eat, and at last she had to go back sorrowfully to Fanfaronade. When he saw that she came empty-handed, he left her, grumbling to himself. The next day they searched again, but with no better success. "Alas," said the princess, "if only I could find something for you to eat, I should not mind being hungry myself." "No, I should not mind that either," answered Fanfaronade. "Is it possible," said she, "that you would not care if I died of hunger? Oh, Fanfaronade, you said you loved me." "That was when we were in quite another place, and I was not hungry," said he. "It makes a great difference in one's ideas to be dying of hunger and thirst on a desert island." At this the princess was dreadfully vexed, and she sat down under the white rose bush and began to cry bitterly. "Happy roses," she said to herself, "they have only to blossom in the sunshine and be admired, and there is nobody to be unkind to them." The tears ran down her cheeks and splashed on the rose tree roots. Presently she was surprised to see a whole bush rustling and shaking, and a soft voice from the prettiest rosebud said, "Poor princess, look in the trunk of that tree, and you will find a honeycomb, but don't be foolish enough to share it with Fanfaronade." Mayblossom ran to the tree, and sure enough, there was the honey. Without losing a moment, she ran with it to Fanfaronade, crying gaily, "See, here is a honeycomb I have found. I might have eaten it all by myself, but I had rather share it with you." But without looking at her or thanking her, Fanfaronade snatched the honeycomb out of her hands and ate it all, every bit, without offering her a morsel. Indeed, when she humbly asked for some, he said mockingly that it was too sweet for her and would spoil her teeth. Mayblossom, more downcast than ever, went sadly away and sat down under an oak tree, and her tears and sighs were so piteous that the oak fanned her with his rustling leaves and said, "Take courage, pretty princess. All is not lost yet. Take this pitcher of milk and drink it. Whatever you do, don't leave a drop for Fanfaronade." The princess, quite astonished, looked round and saw a big pitcher full of milk, but before she could raise it to her lips, the thought of how thirsty Fanfaronade must be after eating at least 15 pounds of honey made her run back to him and say, "Here is a pitcher of milk. Drink some, for you must be thirsty, I am sure, but pray save a little for me. I am dying of hunger and thirst." But he seized the pitcher, drank all it contained at a single draught, and broke it to atoms on the nearest stone, saying with a malicious smile, "As you have not eaten anything, you cannot be thirsty." "Ah," cried the princess, "I am well punished for disappointing the king and queen and running away with this ambassador about whom I knew nothing." And so saying, she wandered into the thickest part of the woods and sat down under a thorn tree, where a nightingale was singing. Presently she heard him say, "Search under the bush, princess. You will find some sugar, almonds, and some tarts there, but don't be silly enough to offer Fanfaronade any." And this time the princess, who was fainting with hunger, took the nightingale's advice and ate what she found all by herself. But Fanfaronade, seeing she had found something good and was not going to share it with him, ran after her in such a fury that she hastily drew out the queen's carbuncle, which had the property of rendering people invisible if they were in danger. And when she was safely hidden from him, she reproached him gently for his unkindness. Meanwhile, Admiral Cocked-Hat had dispatched Jack the Chatterer of the Straw Boots, courier and an ordinary to the prime minister to tell the king that the princess and the ambassador had landed on Squirrel Island. But not knowing the country, he had not pursued them, for fear of being captured by concealed enemies. Their majesties were overjoyed at the news, and the king sent for a great book, each leaf of which was 8 ells long. It was a work of a very clever fairy, and contained a description of the whole earth. He had very soon found that Squirrel Island was uninhabited. "Go," said he to Jack the Chatterer, "tell the admiral from me to land at once. I am surprised at his not having done so sooner." As soon as this message reached the fleet, every preparation was made for war, and the noise was so great that it reached to the ears of the princess, who at once flew to protect Fanfaronade. As he was not very brave, he accepted her aid gladly. "You stand behind me," said she, "and I will hold the carbuncle which makes us invisible, and with the king's dagger I can protect you from the enemy." So when the soldiers landed, they could see nothing, but the princess touched them one after another with a dagger, and they fell insensible upon the sand. At last the admiral, seeing there was some enchantment, hastily gave orders for retreat to be sounded, and his men got back to their boats in great confusion. Fanfaronade, being once more left with the princess, began to think that if he could get rid of her and possess himself the carbuncle and the dagger, he would be able to make his escape. So, as they walked back over the cliffs, he gave the princess a great push, hoping she would fall to the sea. But she stepped aside quickly, and over he went, sinking to the bottom of the sea like a lump of lead, and was never heard of again. While the princess was still looking after him in horror, her attention was attracted by a rushing noise over her head. Looking up, she saw 2 chariots approaching rapidly from opposite directions. One was bright and glittering and drawn by swans and peacocks, while the fairy who sat in it was beautiful as a sunbeam. The other was drawn by bats and ravens, and contained a frightful little dwarf, who, dressed in a snake's skin, wore a great toad upon her head for a hood. The chariots met with a frightful crash in mid-air, and the princess looked on in breathless anxiety, while a furious battle took place between the lovely fairy and her golden lance, and the hideous little dwarf and her rusty pike. Very soon it was evident that the beauty had the best of it, and the dwarf turned her bats' heads and flickered away in great confusion, while the fairy came down to where the princess stood and said, smiling, "You see, princess, I have completely routed the malicious old Caraboss. Will you believe it? She actually wanted to claim you forever, because you came out of the tower 4 days before the 20 years were ended. However, I think I have settled her pretensions, and I hope that you will be very happy and enjoy the freedom I have won for you." The princess thanked her heartily, and then the fairy dispatched one of her peacocks to the palace to bring a gorgeous robe for Mayblossom, who certainly needed it, for her own was torn to shreds by the thorns and briars. Another peacock was sent to the admiral to tell him he could now land in safety, which he did, after bringing all his men with him, even to Jack the Chatterer, who, happening to pass the spit upon which the admiral's dinner was roasting, snatched it up and brought it with him. Admiral Cocked Hat was greatly surprised when he came upon the golden chariot, and saw 2 lovely ladies walking under the trees. When he reached them, he recognized the princess, and went down on his knees and kissed her hand joyfully. Then she presented him to the fairy, and told him how Caraboss had been finally routed, and he thanked the congratulated the fairy, who was most gracious to him. While they were talking, she cried suddenly, "I declare I smell a savory dinner." "Why, yes, madam, here it is," said Jack the Chatterer, holding up the spit, where all the pheasants and partridges were frizzling. "Will your highness please to taste any of them?" "By all means," said the fairy, "especially as the princess will certainly be glad of a good meal." So the admiral sent back to his ship for everything that was needful, and they feasted merrily under the trees. By the time they had finished, the peacock had come back with a robe for the princess, in which the fairy arrayed here. It was of green and gold brocade, embroidered with pearls and rubies, and her long golden hair was tied back with strings of diamonds and emeralds, and crowned with flowers. The fairy made her mount beside her in the golden chariot, and took her on board the admiral's ship, where she bade her farewell, sending many messages of friendship to the queen, and bidding the princess tell her that she was the 5th fairy who had attended the christening. Then salutes were fired, the fleet weighed anchor, and very soon they reached the port. Here the king and queen were waiting, and they received the princess with such joy and kindness she could not get a word in edgewise to say how sorry she had been for having run away with such a poor-spirited ambassador. But, after all, it must have been Caraboss's fault. Just at this lucky moment who should arrive but King Merlin's son, who had become uneasy at not receiving any news from his ambassador, and had traveled with a magnificent escort for 1,000 horsemen and 30 bodyguards in gold and scarlet uniforms to see what could have happened. As he was 100 times handsomer and braver than the ambassador, the princess found she could like him very much. So the wedding was held at once, with so much splendor and rejoicing that all the previous misfortunes were quite forgotten.